The kingdom was quiet after the battle. Music had stopped in the great halls. Soldiers walked with their eyes lowered, and the people spoke in whispers. Once every corner of the stone palace rang with laughter and song, but now only silence filled the air, heavy and sharp. The king, who had always been strong and proud, walked slowly from one end of the throne room to the other. His dark cloak touched the floor, and even the guards dared not speak. His daughter had been the brightest light of his realm. She had fought at the front lines, not hiding behind the walls of gold, but riding at the head of soldiers, her armor shining brighter than the banners. She had been raised as his heir, the one who would bring honor to their name. But in the battle by the Gulf of Red Skies, her fleet had been torn apart. Countless fires rained down, ships broke apart, and reports came back that her vessel had been lost to the storm. When the king heard, he did not weep before his people. He lifted his head high, but inside a storm unlike any battle filled his chest. He locked the chambers of celebration, canceled festivals, and gave orders that no song was to be played anywhere in the land. Noble houses wrapped themselves in mourning colors. Nobles told their children to keep their voices soft in the streets. She had been the hope of her generation, and now she was gone. Without her, the king's heart began to harden. He told himself that weakness had no place in his line. He ordered the army to strike harder against the humans who lived beyond their borders. He told generals to burn every stronghold, to destroy every settlement, until no one dared stand in their way again. His eyes no longer saw a future full of light, but only the shadow of revenge. Far from his halls, however, the young princess still clung to life. She had been thrown from the broken ship when it tore apart in the Gulf. Her escape pod had spun through flames and falling debris, shaking until every bone in her body cried out. The light of her homeworld vanished behind her, and she could not control where the pod took her. The machines sparked, alarms screamed, and each second pressed her closer to the thought of death. The small vessel finally pierced through the clouds of another world. It crashed among wild hills, breaking apart in smoke and fire. When she crawled out, her legs stumbled, her armor cracked and split, blood covering her side. Her lungs filled with burning air, and she could barely lift herself to stand. For a moment she thought perhaps she had already crossed into death, but the sharp pain of her wounds told her this world was real. The land around her was quiet and strange. Instead of shining towers or ships, she saw wooden fences, low houses, and fields of green. Smoke rose from chimneys, not from engines, and animals ran in the distance. Pain forced her down to her knees. The people here, she thought, were not trained for war. They would either fear her or try to kill her. She closed her eyes, expecting the end to come, either from her wounds or from the simple folk of this place. Yet footsteps came closer, and instead of a soldier or an executioner, it was just a man. He wore no armor, carried no shining blade. His shirt was plain, marked with dust, his face unshaven from work in the fields. He looked upon her not with fear, not with hatred, but with quick concern, as if any life lying broken before him was worth saving. His name was Ethan. He did not ask who she was, what world she came from, or what army she commanded. He did not see the crown that once rested on her brow. He only saw a person in need. Without pausing, he pulled her arm over his shoulder and carried her from the smoking wreck into his small home at the edge of the hills. Every step pressed pain through her body, yet she was too weak to resist. She wondered how this thin and ordinary man could carry someone who had trained with the strongest of warriors. Inside his home, he laid her on a simple bed, wrapped her wounds in cloths that smelled faintly of herbs, and placed beside her a bowl of water. His house was nothing compared to the palace she had grown up in. The floor was rough, the roof low, and everything smelled of firewood. But the warmth of the place pressed against the cold fear inside her heart. She did not understand why he helped her when she was a stranger, dressed in armor, with eyes that glowed in the half-light. Yet he seemed not to care. For the first time since the battle, she closed her eyes in peace, not from the certainty of death, but from the strange comfort of a human hand steadying her as she drifted into sleep. When she woke again, the fire had burned low in the small home. The sound of wood cracking filled the air, and through the window she saw dawn painting the hills. Her body ached as if every bone had been struck by iron. She tried to rise, but her side burned with pain, forcing her back into the bed. The cloths tied around her wounds were neat, and she realized the man must have spent hours tending to her. He came in quietly, carrying a wooden bowl. Steam rose from it, and he set it on the table near her. His hands were strong but rough, marked by work. He spoke softly, telling her she must drink if she wanted her strength to return. She looked at him closely now. His eyes were calm, not proud or sharp, just steady, the way a river flows even when storm clouds cover the sky. She asked his name at last. He told her he was called Ethan. When she asked why he had not left her to die in the wreckage, his answer was simple. He said no man should walk away from someone in need, no matter where they came from. She stared at him as if he had spoken a language she had never learned. In her world, kindness was kept for family. Loyalty was bought with oaths, and mercy was rare. Yet this man had risked himself for a stranger, an armored stranger who had fallen from the skies. For the next days, she remained in his home. Each morning he rose before the sun, left to work in the fields, and returned at dusk with tired shoulders. He carried wood, fetched water, and kept the small place alive. But no matter how weary he was, he never forgot to check her wounds, to bring food to her bedside, and to speak as though she was not a burden, but simply a guest. She began to watch him with quiet interest, puzzled by his way of life. She slowly gained her strength. One afternoon, she decided to walk outside, leaning against the frame of the door. Children ran past the fields, chasing one another and laughing so loudly it echoed across the valley. Women drew water from the well, laughing and sharing words in the warm air. Men mended fences, their hands quick and practiced. She realized these people had no fleets, no golden halls, no endless armies, and yet they lived with pride. They worked hard but still found time to sing and talk. She thought of her father's palace, which had fallen into silence since her supposed death. Here in this little village, life glowed brighter than torches on festival nights. That evening, she asked Ethan why they carried on so happily, even when their lives were difficult. He smiled and said that hardship was only one part of living, and that joy could be found even in the smallest things: a meal shared, a story told, a night free from fear. She listened closely. His words were not spoken like speeches of kings, not dressed with grand promises, but plain and honest, and somehow that made them stronger. As nights passed, they spoke more often. She told him little of her true home, hiding the crown she once bore. She only said she had lost her path. Still, he never pressed her for secrets. Instead, he told her of his childhood in the Valley of Storms, that had taken roofs from homes and yet never broken the people. He told of how they rebuilt with their hands, without complaint, because moving forward was the only way they knew. His stories painted a picture of a people that would not be bent no matter what the world threw against them. One night the wind howled outside and rain struck the roof like hammers. She could not sleep. He sat by the fire, carving a small piece of wood into the shape of a bird. She asked him why he wasted time on something with no use. He smiled again and said that not everything had to serve a purpose, that sometimes beauty itself was a reason to continue. She did not answer, but she found herself staring at the bird long after he placed it on the table. In her heart, something began to shift. She had been raised to believe strength was measured by armies, banners, and victories. Yet here was a man with no sword, no command, and still he seemed stronger than warriors she had known. His strength came not from force, but from patience, kindness, and a quiet courage that did not need to be declared. Why did what her father would think of such a man? Perhaps he would dismiss him as weak, as common, as nothing. And yet she, who had known true soldiers, could see that the simple farmer was something rare. Each sunrise she woke with less pain, and each evening she felt less like a stranger. Something about this human spirit, this refusal to bow even to hardship, was beginning to spark within her own chest. She did not yet understand it, but she knew she would not leave this place unchanged. As the days turned into weeks, the princess grew stronger. The deep wounds began to heal, and soon she could walk outside without leaning on the wall for support. The air of the hills filled her chest, sharp and clean, and the sight of the valley stirred something she had never felt. She had grown up in the shadow of towers, banners, and shimmering lights, yet the low houses and green fields seemed more alive to her than any palace had ever been. Ethan worked long hours in the fields. She often stood nearby, at first only watching in curiosity. He pushed the soil with a worn tool, his back bent under the weight of labor, yet he never once complained. His hands grew darker with earth, his shirt soaked with sweat, but when he turned to look at her, his eyes always held that same calm, patient strength. She shook her head at him more than once, unable to understand how someone so ordinary could carry so much peace in his eyes. Eventually, she began to help. At first it was simple tasks, holding a bucket, carrying firewood, or tending the sheep that wandered near the fence. She made mistakes often, spilling water or turning the earth too roughly, but Ethan only laughed softly and showed her again. She felt a strange mix of shame and pride. In her world, she'd commanded ships and warriors. Here, she had to learn like a child all over again. Yet she began to feel that these small tasks required a discipline and patience no less important than battle. As time passed, her heart softened. One evening, she sat by the fire while children from the village gathered. They listened to Ethan tell stories of storms and harvests of ancestors who had come before them with nothing but their hands. The children laughed and clapped when he reached the end of his tale, and they crowded around him as if he were a hero. She watched from the side, quiet and troubled. She had seen men with bright medals and banners who could not stir such light in a crowd. And now this plain man, dressed in worn clothes, brought joy to hearts with nothing but his voice. She asked him later why people listened to him so eagerly. He only shrugged and said they needed hope, and stories gave them reason to smile even when days were hard. His words lingered in her mind. In her world, leaders commanded with fear, with power, with the edge of a sword. But here leadership was born from love, from the willingness to stand beside others, not above them. Still, her heart was restless. She often slipped away to the edge of the valley, gazing into the distance. She thought of her father, alone in the palace, consumed by grief and anger. She thought of soldiers still marching, believing their princess lay dead. She had not told Ethan who she truly was, and the secret pressed more heavily on her each day. Yet part of her feared that once he knew, the simple bond they shared might shatter. One afternoon, strangers arrived at the edge of the village. They were rough men bearing the marks of war. Their voices were sharp, demanding food and coin in exchange for leaving the village unharmed. The people grew pale with fear, whispering among themselves. Ethan stepped forward calmly, speaking with the men in a low and even tone. He offered them bread and water, asking them to leave in peace. They laughed at him, calling him weak. The princess felt her old fire rising. She had lived as a warrior too long to watch in silence. She gripped a wooden pole resting by the fence and stepped forward, her voice strong and steady. The men paused when they saw her stance, her glowing eyes now clear with fury. Weakened from her long recovery, she moved like a trained fighter, each motion sharp and sure. The men mocked her at first, but the force of her steps drove them back. She struck the ground with the wooden pole so hard that dust rose, and her eyes burned with a command that made their laughter die. The intruders hesitated, then muttered curses as they fled toward the hills. The villagers stood in silence until Ethan turned to her. His face did not show surprise, only quiet respect. She could see in his eyes that he understood then she had not been an ordinary traveler, yet he did not question her. Instead, he only thanked her for her courage, as though she had been no different than any other friend who had stepped forward to defend the home they shared. That night, the villagers lit fires in celebration. They offered her food and drink, calling her a savior. She sat among them, listening to laughter once more, but her mind was troubled. She realized she could never stay hidden forever. The day would come when she must return to her father's halls, to her people, and their endless war. Yet the thought of leaving this small place, with its warmth and humanity, brought her an ache deeper than any wound. And as she glanced at Ethan across the firelight, watching how calmly he smiled at his people, she understood something new was growing within her heart, something she could not easily tear away. Weeks passed after the fight with the raiders, but the memory still lived in the hearts of the villagers. They spoke of the moment the princess had stood tall, with nothing but a wooden pole in her hands, and sent the men fleeing into the hills. Yet she did not enjoy their praise. She remembered the look of fear in their eyes, the memory of years of battle rising up from within her. She wanted to protect, yet part of her knew those sharp skills belonged to a darker past she could not fully escape. Ethan never treated her as a hero. He still asked her to carry water, to split wood, to tend the sheep. He showed no interest in her strength as a warrior, only in the ways she could live each day with patience. She found herself grateful for this. Around him, she could almost pretend she was not the daughter of a king. Not a commander who had led armies, but just a person who was learning how to live again. At night, she often dreamed of her father's halls. She saw the long stone passages, the throne of iron and gold, and her father sitting alone, its expression full of sorrow and rage. She knew he believed her dead, and by now his anger toward humans would have grown even greater. If she stayed in the valley, she would be at peace, yet her heart told her she could not hide forever. She was his daughter, and duty would always call her back. But she was no longer the same as she had once been. One evening, the village gathered on the fields to share bread and music. Someone had built a fire, and the people danced around it with joy. Children clapped their hands, and the old men played instruments with steady fingers. The princess sat close to the firelight and watched Ethan move among the people. Not as a leader barking orders, but as a friend who listened to each voice. He carried the same weight as a king, but wore it without a crown. She thought to herself that here was true strength, greater than the power of armies. Later that night, when the fire was dying, she sat alone under the stars. Ethan came beside her and laid a small loaf of bread in her hands. She asked him a question she had held back for many days. Why did he never fear, even when others threatened his people? Why did he never bow to anger? His eyes looked up at the stars as he answered, saying that fear only grew stronger if it controlled a man. He believed life was too short to waste on hate. Instead, he chose to stand steady, not with rage, but with faith that people must protect one another if they wish to survive. His words struck her like arrows, not because they were dressed in fine speech, but because they were so plain. She realized that all her life she had been taught that might proved worth. To conquer was to lead, to destroy was to win. Yet here was a man who had none of those things, and still showed the kind of strength that kingdoms could not defeat. As she listened, her heart stirred with a blend of respect and something more. She could no longer deny that she was drawn to him in ways deeper than friendship. But the peace of the valley would not last. One morning, a wounded soldier from her father's kingdom crossed the borders and arrived there. His clothes were torn and his voice was weak, but when he saw her, he fell to his knees. He called her name, crying that the king had grown half-mad with grief, calling for endless war. The soldier said the kingdom's armies prepared to burn down many human villages in revenge, convinced that humans had destroyed the royal line. The people of the valley heard this news and grew fearful, looking upon the princess as though she were both hope and danger at once. She stood still, her heart torn in two. She wanted to remain beside Ethan, where life was simple and true. But she knew she could not turn away from her father's suffering, or from the war her absence had worsened. She looked at Ethan and saw he was calm, though sorrow rested in his eyes. He did not beg her to stay, nor did he ask her to go. He simply said the choice was hers, but whichever path she chose, she would not walk it alone. That night, as she lay awake, she thought of two lives. One was filled with memories of iron crowns, banners, and endless battles under her father's command. The other was filled with the quiet strength of a farmer whose spirit shone brighter than any army. She knew she could not keep both. Still, she also knew that the man from the valley had already changed her view of the world forever, and no choice would take that away. And so, as dawn came to the valley, she prepared herself to return at last to her father's court. Beside her stood Ethan, plain in his clothes, but unshaken in his resolve, ready to walk into halls of kings without fear. The journey back to the palace was long. The roads stretched through valleys and across empty plains, marked by broken villages and fields that had turned to ash. The princess walked with steady steps, her cloak worn from travel, but her spirit burning with determination. At her side walked Ethan, carrying little more than food and water, yet his presence was stronger than any guard. She had chosen to return, not for war, but to bring with her the truth she had discovered in the valley. When the gates of the capital finally came into sight, the guards froze in shock. They rubbed their eyes as if they saw a spirit, for news had carried for months that the princess was long dead. Yet here she was, her figure tall and certain, her eyes shining with fire. The guards dropped to their knees, rushing to open the gates, sending word ahead faster than any messenger could. By the time she reached the great square, the people had gathered, their voices rising in disbelief and joy. They cried her name, tears streaming, unable to believe their lost hope had returned. But in the throne room, the king did not rise at once. He sat alone, his great shoulders bent from the weight of grief. His beard had grown heavy, and his eyes burned with sleepless nights. When the doors opened, and his daughter walked forward, silence seized the chamber. At first he believed it was a dream sent to haunt him, but when her voice rang out, strong and steady, his body shook. He stepped down from the throne, his hand trembling as he reached for her, as if fearing she would vanish like smoke. Father and daughter embraced, and for one bright moment, the walls of the palace felt alive again. Yet the joy soon faltered, for the king saw the man who stood beside her. Ethan did not bow, nor did he show fear, though hundreds of armored men lined the floor. He stood plain and firm, his eyes steady, just as he had always been. The king drew back with a frown. His voice thundered, as he demanded to know why his child had returned with a human, the very people he blamed for war and loss. The court grew tense, whispers rising like the hiss of serpents. The princess raised her voice before her father's anger could spread further. She told the chamber all that had happened, of her fall, her wounds, and the way Ethan had saved her life when she was nothing but a broken stranger in his field. She spoke of the human spirit, of their will to live and laugh even in the face of despair. She told of their courage, their patience, their quiet strength that no blade could strike down. The king listened, though his face was still hard. He turned on Ethan at last and asked him to explain why he had dared walk into the Hall of Kings. Ethan's answer was plain. He said he had done nothing remarkable, only helped someone in need, because to abandon another life would have been wrong. He said war could burn villages and tear down walls, but it could not remove the duty people owed to one another. His words carried no polish, no grand pledge, and yet they echoed in the great chamber, louder than any speech of generals. The court fell silent. Even the old advisors, who had lived their lives among power and riches, could not find fault in the simple truth of those words. The king's eyes narrowed. For a long time he stared into the face of the man who stood unbowed before him. What he saw there was not weakness, but a strength forged without crowns or swords, a strength his kingdom had forgotten. Slowly, the king's voice softened. He admitted that grief had blinded him, that his anger had nearly driven his people into endless destruction. His daughter had returned not with an army, not with banners, but with a single man whose heart spoke clearer than 1,000 trumpets. He saw then that perhaps the humans were not enemies to be crushed, but allies who could teach his people how to endure.
Ow.
In the days that followed, peace did not come all at once. Suspicion lingered, and old wounds bled slowly. But the return of the princess and the presence of Ethan created a new path. Soldiers trained beside farmers, and strangers learned one another's names. Festivals were lit again, and music once more filled the halls that had been silent for far too long. The people often asked how such change began. They were told the story of a princess lost in battle who returned from the edge of death, not alone, but with a human by her side. And they learned that sometimes it is not the sharpest sword or the mightiest crown that changes the fate of kingdoms, but the steady hand of someone who refuses to turn away from another's need. And in those words, the kingdom found its new dawn.